Hello, everybody. Welcome back to an episode of Coffee Convos. I'm your host, John, and today we have Mike Reynolds in the house. Give Mike a big round of applause.
Thank you, John. Glad to be here.
Thanks for being here. Mike is running for one of the city council seats, and Mike is competing against another Mike. Mike in District 1, right?
That is correct. It is the Mike Show. Mike and Mike.
District 1 happens to be my district. So you ready to just amaze me?
I hope so.
Did you know that there's another Mike Reynolds that lives in Folsom?
Oh, absolutely. The first time I met Rosario, I walked up to her because she looked like she was looking for somebody. We were meeting where there's the tattoo place now, at the end of Sutter Street. And I walked up to her and I said, hi, I think we're supposed to meet. I'm Mike Reynolds. And you could just see her face kind of give you that dog head twist. Where it's like, no. It's like, no, I am. And she's like, oh, there's a real estate guy. That's who I thought I was meeting.
That's hilarious. Yeah, the other Mike, he might say he's the original Mike. His daughter works with us and has for quite some time. So.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, that's how I knew that. Well, thanks for being here today. Mike, why don't you give us your elevator pitch and tell us about yourself?
Okay. Yeah. So I'm 22 years in Folsom. I moved down to the historic district in 2010. A lot of that was, when I saw the city allocate the revitalization funds. And at that point, I was already a big Sam Horns fan. And so you're like, hey, them doing this, this could be pretty cool. And we had always at one point, lived in a city where we could walk to stuff. And we're like, it'd be really neat to be down there because now all of a sudden you can become walking versus being in Empire Ranch where everything was getting in the car. So that was how I got down here. Fast forward, the historic Folsom Residents Association rekindled in 19. And I happened to, join the initial board because I was interested in what was going on. And over time, my Intel skills, so I'm 27 years plus at Intel, start to kick in. And so I started to say, hey, we have to get focused, strategic planning. What can we deliver, for the residents versus using it just as gripe sessions? And after the first year, the current president goes, I only want to do it for a year. You need to take over. And so I got to be the president. And then there was a couple of things, that we listed on there that I was successful in driving to completion. Parking for the residents up on Figueroa is kind of the big one. And through that whole process, you have to build a lot of relationships with merchants, the Historic Preservation League, all these people, that were kind of going to have a voice in things. And then work with the city and all of its idiosyncrasies. And so that combination of stuff and the fact that I kind of see problems through an engineering lens, when I got done or started working on those and having some success, people were like, you should consider running for city council. We like the way you talk. We like the way you've been able to get results. And so it was one of those, I'll call it serendipitous events when enough people that you respect, ex-mayors, people who run some of these groups say, you should go do this. How often does that fall into your lap versus having to go claw your way to the next thing? So anyway, with enough of that encouragement and the fact that we went to districts, right? The district makes a big difference because I understand the problems down here and I have sort of a symbiotic relationship with, the people, the natural stuff, just the whole area that would be hard to do for me personally on a broad city scope. But at the district level, I can pretty much feel the pulse of what goes on down here. And so I felt like there was a way for me to engage and add value.
Yeah. Of course, you do have to be, wholesomely minded. Of course,
Yeah.
I don't hear you not saying that. But so if you look at a map of the districts, if somebody doesn't know where District 1 is, so it's really, if you kind of made a triangle of the upper left corner top of the districts, that's where it is, right? So
yeah, I call it kind of the river district, right? Because there is a piece that Glen is the southern boundary. Bidwell is kind of, one part of it. It's like an L shape and is one part of the boundary, but then everything else loops around the river and is north of Natoma. So in my opinion, the natural piece of that, there's two constituencies down here, right? There's the people and the natural elements, and there's a tight relationship, I think, and only one of those constituents has a voice. And so I think a lot of what the job of the person representing this district is to make sure that those elements are represented in balance with commercial elements that obviously need to be present too for everybody to be successful.
Yeah, yeah. So some right now are talking once again. It kind of rises to the top every once in a while about the actual what we have referred to as the river district, and talking about the two constituents. Some would say that there are too many people in the constituents with a voice category that want to take advantage of the natural habitat and the feel of the river district and so on and so forth. So there's good people that line up on both sides of this issue. When you think about what could potentially happen in the river district, what do you think about? What would you fight for? What are you passionate about?
Well, I mean, there's kind of two pieces to it, right? There's let's do the basic quantitative approach to it, or quantitative approach, and say, there's, as you noted, there's going to be, you could have a pendulum on it's pure natural, you could have a pendulum on pure commercial. I'm a pretty centrist person, moderate on most things, and in the end, to have it be pure natural is probably going to be a tough thing to get, because ultimately something's got to pay sort of the overhead of whatever existence there is. So in my mind, it could be a half and a half, where it's a half natural, half commercial. It could be a third, and a third, where it's part natural, part residential, part commercial. Those, to me, if I'm just doing it pure quantitatively, is the outcomes that I would probably argue for. And then there gets to be the piece where I get back to that symbiotic relationship down here, is then you also have to curate what do you put in there. And I'll give you an example, right? If the city was desperate for tax dollars and commercial wins the day in the purest sense, let's go put a giant Hampton Inn, right? 4-story Hampton Inn down there because we want more, lodging. That would be so not in keeping with the sort of soul of this district, that would, to me, be a thing that you have to have somebody who sort of understands what will the residents tolerate, and then work to help shape that, right? It's because I don't think any resident that I've ever met is anti-development. They just want it done harmoniously with where they live. And so I think that's the biggest piece, is if you feel like you have that pulse, then you can help guide some of those decisions and say, not this, but maybe this and this would be options to consider. And so, that way you keep the conversation moving forward, instead of people entrenching and saying it's a binary answer of yes or no.
Okay. So there's a this and this, but not this.
Yeah.
Okay. I appreciate you too saying, talking in terms of a district having a soul. A city has a personality, a soul, but also there are, in my opinion, there's different Folsoms. It's all one thing, but there's definitely a different
Absolutely.
vibe and a feel of what is happening down in the historic district, of which I am a part and own a business in. So yeah, it's good to hear you talk about that and to say that matters. So if no matter what happens down there, you well know, especially because of the ways you've served in the past, that parking has been an issue, and it's you said you've been involved in some parking things around Figueroa Street. So is parking still something that's a hot topic and something that you will keep a lively part of the conversation?
Yeah. So, if I looked at the priorities I sketched out, the two that you just hit on were number 1 and 2. Number 1, what's the river district plan? Number 2, what is the infrastructure plan? And, when I went into the way it starts off, of course, is that the residents that were the most impacted on Figueroa, per the ad hoc committee report, that was what they identified as the hot zone. That wasn't something I made up, or that, Hefra made up. And so we said, okay, let's see if we can bring relief to that. But that was just one particular line item in that ad hoc report. And so again, my intel sense starts kicking in and saying, well, you've spent money on this report. Let's talk about what's the schedule, what's the timeline, what things are on your pick list, what order are they going to go in, when can we expect the actions to take place. And that was what kind of drove a more holistic approach to it. And so the more I immersed myself in it, then you start trying to up level to, why is this thing, when something doesn't move forward that seems obvious that it should, you say, what is the part of the story that I'm missing? And so one of the things that became clear was that there was a disagreement on exactly what is the problem statement, meaning there was a parking report that was done, but what we should go off and fund when there's a lack of clarity of the problem statement leads to sort of this, I'll call it slow burn or almost gridlock, right? And so the camps, that the way it started on the resident side was, you better go build a bridge or a new garage, because that's what everything says you got to go do. but you realize that's a heavy lift for the city. I got to get ground. I need to go figure out where I'm going to go procure $40 million of money because there is no redevelopment fund. So where's that going to come from? And I think that caused them to just deer in the headlights, where they just stopped and said, we see no line of sight to achieving this. And so then they didn't do anything, versus the way I approached it was like, hey, let's build this into a pick list of what's super low hanging fruit that we could go do. Then what's more medium term that may take some planning and some resourcing. And I'll generally say something up to $1 million. And then the home run is that you're up in the thing of, well, we got to go build a new garage. But first we have to agree, do we have a parking management problem or a parking capacity problem? And so the kind of the low hanging fruit stuff was, can we balloon squeeze to the parking garage and say, okay, this thing is full on Saturday nights, or it's not full on Saturday nights. And so if it's never full, then you'd say, well, actually, we don't have a parking capacity problem. We have a management problem. And then maybe that's the end of the conversation. But the wild card and all that is the build outs and the, with the Granite House and other stuff that Jerry Bordeaux is going to go build. And so, you get these things along the way that it's hard to take complex problems, and I call it, net present value, then back to a time zero, and have that somehow be encompassing of all the nuances that will unfold over time. And so part of that idea of staging through it is to say, what will change? With the folks that own Dorothea's mentioned one time in a meeting that, hey, people that come down and shop now shop differently. They're not buying. They're just looking at their phones and then leaving and potentially going and buying online. And so the things that you reflect on that were true historically, and maybe even true when the study started, if you fast forward 10 years, will those things also be true? And so to me, somewhere along the way, as you're stair stepping your way through these investment levels, you have to game out, are the assumptions I made still true? And then two, if in fact they are still on the right, trajectory, are there ways that I can diminish the criticality of the problem? Meaning, could I tamp down the amount of infrastructure? Could I reorient parking? Could I use light rail from outside the district lots? Could we use a shuttle program that eventually tells you I got to go build a garage, but instead of it being 4 stories, I just need to do 2, right? It's kind of that way of sort of approaching this. So the answer to your question at the beginning is yes, there's still an issue. Yes, I'm still looking at that as one of the top priorities, but how that problem unspools itself over time is sort of still of an unknown. And so it's, to me, doing that sort of smart engineering approach, spend the least amount of money to get the most benefit along the way until you absolutely recognize what you have to do. And then you got to go marshal the resources to figure out how to go do it.
Okay. Good. Let's talk wider angle view then, Folsom as a whole outside of our district that we both love.
Yep.
What needs to happen in our city? What are the things, if you were to make a list, for the whole city, where you say, this is an issue that there's no getting around this? What's the number one for you?
Sustainable revenue stream. So
okay.
There was a budget workshop back in February that I got invited to by being in Heference. I was fortunate to be able to listen in on this. And as they're going through it, things that stood out to me. And if you go look at the budget, you can see this, right? So I validated all this by going back and looking at the public published budget. But if you look, property tax revenues are going up at a pretty good clip, and that's easy to see, right? As houses transact, and then all of south of 50, right? There's no Prop 13 for south of 50. Everything is at full market value today. So there's a very nice revenue ratio that comes from property tax you see there. On the other hand, if you go look at sales tax in 5 of the last 7 years was flat to down. And only in 22 did it pop again. And there's a projection for 23 that it will continue to go up. The term that they use, there was a couple of things going on. Number one, and the one that stood out the most in my mind, was the Amazon effect, that how the online shopping parses, and Amazon obviously being the biggest player in the business of it, how that sales tax revenue gets parsed back to the cities is at a lower rate than a purchase local, because of how Amazon has clearly lobbied their way into that they've said, well, this is the solution we'll provide, and then lobbied their way into not being told that you can't do it that way. And so that is beginning to starve cities. And you can imagine over COVID, when no one shopped, that whole habit just got ingrained and amplified, right? And so you have that as number one. And then number two that stood out that I would have never thought of had I not listened to this, because if you've been here for 12 years like I have and bought, at the bottom of the downturn, but all the folks that are coming new, like south of 50 now, that have to invest at an 800,000 or greater clip, there's a crowding out effect of their disposable income. And so the combination of those two things is really hampering the sales tax revenue to the point that I call it systemic, right? You can look at this and say, wishing this to go away will not happen. And so now you would, to me, in my opinion, you have to go to task force mode and say, this is a problem that isn't going away. We are going to have to bring people to the table, and we're going to have to start escalating this up through our own elected representatives, to the Ken Cooleys, to the Pelosi, to the Feinstein, because if it's happening to us, as affluent a city as we are, it's happening to everybody. And so, why is this allowed to exist? Because you can't necessarily fix the housing piece of it. That is what it is, other than just build a lot more of them. But to have a tax plan that is solely dependent now on additional housing footprint growth as your only strategy, then says when you butt up to White Rock, there's going to be this hunger to go again and keep just making the city bigger and bigger. I'm not sure that's in fitting with what the residents of the city want. And so you have to go figure out a way to solve that sales tax revenue stream and do it in a way that it's going to take some time, right? And I think that I felt like that was a miss even PR wise, because just when I heard that, I have literally consciously started getting in the car to go buy things at a Walmart or something that I certainly could have hit send on Amazon and had it shipped to me. But when I recognize what that's doing, when they say buy local, it always feels like it's, we should buy, it's a patriotic thing, but it's now becoming a sustainability thing. And so we need to figure out how we're going to sustain this. And that to me seems like problem number one, because everything else in terms of public safety, amenities, all the things that we like, it's all predicated on having a revenue stream that supports where we are. And if we run out of growth, what's your plan now? Because property taxes will only grow at Prop 13 rates, right? That's 3% a year. So you can just start to see that there's a terminal velocity problem that looms on the horizon, that, the job of any council at any time is to say, I should leave this better so that 10 years from now or 20 years from now, whoever comes in gets the same things that I got.
Okay. So what exactly are you asking for or fighting for in terms of the sales tax? Are you in favor of raising the sales tax, or
no? I think that's the last resort, right?
That's what I thought I heard you saying, but I wanted to make sure.
No. What I think you do, the first thing you're going to go do is work through your elected representatives, because again, if it's happening to us, it's happening all up and down California. Yeah. There is an association of cities. California should be able to bond together and get through your elected representatives, say, I'm sorry, Amazon, this is not fair. And they'll tell you it's hard. And I'll tell you, because of what I do at Intel, it's the amount of money and effort they will spend to go build a recommendation engine that tells you what to do next dwarfs what it would take them to update that software. And they do that on a yearly cadence, right? So anytime they say, oh, this is hard and we can't do this, it's just because they don't want to, right? And so to me, that's, job one is to go figure out how you at least level it back to the way it was when people could only shop local. Now that still may be a function of that's insufficient. And so then the other piece of it gets to economic development, right? That you have Sacramento was the number 3 influx metro in the country. And I think you could argue most of them probably came out of the Bay Area. And so there's probably a lot of high-priced knowledge workers that came along with that. And so how do you use that to establish an economic development strategy? Because I work at Intel, I know there's a huge foundation in hardware development and storage, because Micron's here, Kioxia is here, right? You can draw these circles, and what high tech folks tend to do is gravitate towards where there's talent pool buckets, because then they can recruit and stay local instead of having to go harvest nationally. And so what did all these influx get us? Are there other players that we can go after? But at minimum, there are players that don't have presence here who could take advantage of the foundations that the Intels and Microns and stuff have already laid. That do we have a strategy to recruit and try and get them to build satellite offices here? Can you work with the county and all the adjoining, was that SACOG, right, groups? So this was one of the, I think I put in my chamber application, because Intel has a fleet of airplanes, right? So when I go to the Bay Area, I just hop on a shuttle and I get to go down there for the day and pop back. But if you have all these transplant people here, most of them at some point need to go into the office. It could be as much as once a week. And if you don't leave before 5, that's a 4-hour grind. Could you establish sort of a regional transport with the idea of, if we can create this sort of fluidity between the areas, it makes Sacramento and Folsom a much easier region to hub from as a remote worker, because that is a thing that is here to stay, right? So express trains, could you have it where they invest in a sort of rented shuttle that, one flight each way a day, on Tuesday through Thursday, which is kind of the windows that everybody always does. They stay home Monday, Wednesdays, but they need to be in the office on those days. That's just kind of riffing examples of how do you keep upping the game of what Sacramento has based on what's already started. So those are kind of two prongs, right? Because if you have more income, then you have more sort of discretionary spends. And if you can figure out how to alleviate the Amazon stuff, then you can at least try and bring yourself up back to parity.
Okay, good. Thank you for that. If you were to win this seat, you would be a newbie. You'd be a newcomer to the city council. What makes you? Let's ask it this way: how are you best positioned to be the best man for the job? What do you bring to the table that the others don't?
So, like I said, I think it's a combination of some of the things I've already touched on. That I'm a centrist thinker, so I can be very technical. I can be very business oriented. I can be strategic. I'm pretty good at building relationships. How we got progress. The reason I have every one of the council members is a text number on my phone and can get responses back and forth is in a short period of time I was able to build those connections with them. And so I think I'm really good at building relationships with people. And then because I'm kind of a moderate thinker, because I tend to parse things into small manageable chunks, I don't plant flags and say it's this or nothing, and so I think if you can figure out ways to work with people to reach common goals. But I just think, my background, that sort of super set of skills that I've developed over all these years, and having my little proof point that if I can, do that from scratch in a civic setting, I don't see that there's anything that prevents that from being carried forward into a broader sense of doing it for the city.
Yeah. I'm a huge fan of getting along, of working together, of, peace and love. Are you a fighter?
I mean, I will dig in if something crosses my value stream, so it just kind of depends. I'm like a step function, right? I'll run on a flat line until something triggers a value thing. And then I will, then I can become fairly intense where I need to be.
Yeah. All right, good. I appreciate that. Do you think that our city right now, do you feel like we're forward thinking?
I mean, I'll probably try to, I think this is answering the question. So, one, you look at how good this place is. I'm a big on metaphors and stories, whenever I talk on stuff, so I think people relate to that, and how they receive information. And so, the thing I say is, we're not Detroit, right? In Detroit's case, you're trying to figure out how you can even sustain city services, period, because your core has been so hollowed out. Yeah. We live a very charmed existence, especially in District 1. I have a friend that said, we live better in District 1 than 99% of the people in the world. And I would argue that that's easily true, right? So there's no knock on the situation that we're in. Part of the reason when you say, why did you decide to run? Part of my fear was, that there was nobody who had that connection to District 1 who would fight for the vision of what it should be, right? The curation of what the district should be. And then number two, going to things and listening to the discourse around problems, it starts to feel like everything was treated in isolation like a problem of its own. And that doesn't mean that there isn't a strategy, but it feels like if it is, it's very sort of loosely thought out and not well measured. And so if that means not forward thinking, then my answer would be, yeah, I think there's work to be done. And I'll give you an example of kind of what that means. Like when you do budgeting for the year, right? I mean, you look at it, it's a brand, right? The city is a brand. You know, we're the board of directors. Elaine's the CEO. The product is the city, and the businesses and residents are the consumers of it. And so you say, wow, how do we have such a great reputation? Well, you know what drove those things, you know, public safety, the amenities, our infrastructure. And you say, okay, and so how do I measure the goodness of what I have done? And then how do I measure that I'm continuing to at least maintain that goodness? Because you're either going forward or you're falling backwards. There is no such thing as status quo, even though people like to think there is. It is impossible in nature to have that physically happen, right? And so I think that piece of, you know, saying this is what we value, this is how we measure it. And so when something comes up and should we do A or B, it should get measured against which one satisfies our strategic requirements. Can we measure the benefit of it? And if you can't do that, you get back to my point about it feels like we're doing things in isolation, where it's not serving a grander strategy and not being measured with, I'll call it kind of a quarterly operational. How are we doing? Are we meeting our goals? Is there a reason that we're not? You know, sort of that's that. I realize it's very corporate-y, but I haven't run into anything yet that tells me those sort of same philosophy things that I learned from Andy Grove at Intel when I first started aren't applicable in almost any organization I've been in. And the city would fall into that same category. It's like, why can't we do it this way?
Yeah, yeah. I appreciate you answering these questions. And certainly none of these are designed to like trap or to pit anybody against one another. I'm actually friends with everybody that's running for this right now. And I love them all. And so it's just good to hear everybody's opinion on these things, and I appreciate you being honest. Can you talk a little bit about your thoughts on the current state of our law enforcement, and maybe what your vision is for that? Do you think there's a problem? If so, how do we handle it? How do we move forward? Or is it all good?
I mean, I'll kind of back to that, you know, when I was using the strategy and the metric stuff, I'll use kind of the law enforcement and fire department because they both sort of have sort of different stories that go with them, right? So law enforcement, I know, there's a certain, here's our number of officers or patrol people per 1,000 people. And if you look at the growth rate of the city, they're not making that same ratio. And so it doesn't mean on a year to year basis, you always must be there, but it's always a starting point of, well, you know, we always have this many per 10,000 or per 1,000 people. And here's our response times that we measure, right? You know, this is what we expect it to be because that's what made it a great city. And if you go and all of a sudden the response times triple, quadruple because you're no longer able to do that, you know, it's you ever hear of the theory? It's kind of, to me, it's sort of an offshoot of the theory of broken glass that, you know, small things start to matter and those small things start to create the downswing. And all of a sudden, if you lose your, you know, the shine of on your gem, maybe companies don't want to relocate anymore because they've heard that certain things aren't what they used to be. So Folsom isn't at that state yet. They just have a headcount ratio problem. And so beyond that, from, you know, the position that I'm sitting in, I'm not going to claim to know all the details because that would be hubris, right? But it's certainly a starting point to say, hey, these things are below what we think are historical norms. What are we going to do to address those? The fire department, on the other hand, let's take that ratio. That same thing applies. But then you look at there's some strategic missions that are creeping up for the fire side that I would argue, you know, police doesn't have this giant wave of crime, you know, coming in that they maybe have to deal with on the horizon. But on the other hand, if you think of District 1 and like American River Canyon, Hinkle Creek, and all the area along the American River that the historic district borders, given the droughts that we've got, and in some of the places, the inaccessibility to engines, you know, I understand the fire department got a federal grant to do fuel clearing in Hinkle Creek, but that means you had an extraneous funding source go do something that strategically you really should be doing, right? Because that is now a risk that is sitting front and center. If you run the historic district all along the American River Canyon, that's state owned. So the city has no control over that fuel reduction. And yet this is a strategic problem. That's kind of one of those things where you start to say, well, I'm not funded just on my ratio thing. But on the other hand, there's this strategic problem that's crept up. And now I have to figure out how I'm going to go fund that too. right? And so you get into this kind of give and take of where do you spend your monies, but you can't bury your head in the sand and just say, well, we don't have enough to go do it. Because if all of a sudden, something happens on the wrong windy day and you lose, 30 or 40 houses in the Hinkle Creek area, now what? Right. And so I think that's kind of the example of it isn't just, is it at the right state? Is it at the right state? Are we measuring it well? And have we identified what some of the strategic over the horizon things could be? And are we starting to deal with those?
Yeah, good. Can you talk about your thoughts on traffic and not just congestion, but things like erratic driving and speeding and the other things that we just hear a lot of talk about this lately. So maybe you can kind of open up that chapter a bit.
Yeah, and I'm afraid sometimes these come across from the cheap seats, but I'll go back to my kind of branding point again. Sort of the transit times through the city, and if you're Detroit, like I said, you're trying just to tread water for infrastructure. If you're a good city, you're probably behind the curve of when you need it, but you'll get to it eventually. And if you're a great city, you're ahead of the curve. And there was a discussion the other night around budgeting, and they talked about, well, we anticipate starting construction on the Empire Ranch Exchange in 26. And the resident growth rate is at a 300 people a month clip south of 50. The only transit point for that immediate grouping is to either fan out down White Rock, which is not necessarily, that's a pretty circuitous way to get across the river, to get across the highway, or it all plugs through East Bidwell. So that to me is like, I don't know all the ins and outs of why is it till 26, but that feels to me from the cheap seats that's a bit of a miss, because by the time 26 arrives and the number of houses built across there, Bidwell is going to be a disaster, even under the ideal circumstances. And not only will Bidwell be a disaster, but the exit at 5 o'clock on Fridays will back up past that right turn lane, place where it adds an extra lane, and now start jamming up 50 all the way back to Prairie City, if not further, right? And so, or I guess, do people get off at Prairie City and go all the way down and around? I mean, again, you have to be thinking what's going to happen because it's already sitting there. And then you get to more of the tactical pieces. Somebody threw out to me that Folsom is a city of stoplights. And until they said that, I hadn't really thought about it in that sense. But, now if you go look, if you get off at Bidwell, there are 4 stoplights before you hit that first corner where Whole Foods is. And there's another 3 just to get to Broadstone. Mm-hmm. And so you start to say, it's like, just by default, it's a manufacturing problem, right? And you're putting stops at every piece of your flow. You have to identify your traffic corridors and you have to defend those. And, it feels back to this sort of tactical, well, the businesses need to have it so people can get in and out of here, but you just chopped up one of your main corridors and said, I won't move traffic through this, and then provided no alternative. And then you have no other exit, like Empire Ranch Road as an exit. You don't have an Oak Avenue overpass. I mean, all these things that I hear on the books, the front and center thing is we're building houses like crazy, and we're going to jam up that exit and all that place where no one's even going to want to go there because it's going to be so gridlocked in those windows between 3 and 6. Right. So, when you kind of ask me about infrastructure, that to me is sort of a feeling of, it feels a little like it's swinging in the wind, as opposed to having a deterministic approach to it and trying to accelerate it and use whatever means to go to the county, to the state, to the federal, to accelerate funds and whatever it takes, because we're going for, who could have seen an 8% growth rate in the Sacramento Valley and what happened in south of 50? I bet they didn't plan for that growth rate, that they thought the number maybe was going to be 2%. Instead it's 5, right? So it feels like we're behind the curve.
Yeah. Mike, it's been a pleasure having you here. I have a ton of questions I could ask you, but we are out of time. I really appreciate you taking the time. I do have one more question, which I am asking every one of the candidates, and it's playful. It means nothing. It's a section I call Politicians Answer Medical Questions.
Oh, 5'9", 175.
So here you go. Here's your question.
Okay.
Doctor, my ear has been popping like crazy. And I went to the doctor. He said, there's nothing in there. My hearing is fine. I just had a hearing test. What do you think's going on with my ear?
I think your shoulders hurt. And if you just do this, it'll go away. No, pressure, I would argue if you're having popping in your ear that your ability to clear the pressure, right? It's like people struggle with that when they dive. As you get older, it gets harder to clear the pressure. So,
Mm.
you may be more susceptible. And with like I didn't have allergies. Now I feel it through my eyes itch. And so those are my subliminal indicators. And so, allergies affects people in different ways because they're essentially a result of inflammation. Do you have subliminal allergy trends that are starting to cause inflammation? That between that and aging, it's harder to clear the pressure on your ears, just like going diving. It's harder for me to do it than when I was younger.
Wow. You answered that question way better than I thought you would. I thought it was fantastic.
I'm an engineer.
Wait, I think I actually learned something. Mike, thanks for your time. All right. All right.
Okay. Nice meeting you, and thanks for letting me share 40 minutes with you.
Yeah. Good luck on your journey, man.
Thanks. Cheers.